Hello and welcome back to Watching Brief. Today we have a bit of a treat for you. We've gathered together as a trio, and today this trio includes myself, my typical co-host, Mr. Andy Brockman, and the wonderful Steph Black. Hello, Steph.
Hi, thank you
Hello.
for having me.
You're very welcome. Steph is known as the Adventuring Archaeologist on Instagram and also ArcThot on TikTok. And she is an interesting persona in this context. And the reason I say that is that you are, in that sense, an observer, are you not? Not only of humanity, as we all are, but also, to a certain extent, of archaeological practice here in the UK. Um, and I figured that your perspective would be interesting in today's conversation. How are you doing, Andy? Anything interesting happening?
Somebody's doing some DIY next door, so I hope it's not intruding on the soundtrack.
Well, well, to be
But
fair,
apart from
folks at home, that would just be the latest in a long litany of intrusions and balls ups. This is like number 6 in terms of the beginning of this video, but we are here today to talk about archaeology comms, PR, and what I suppose used to be commonly called public archaeology. I think it technically still exists as a concept, but it's become, as Belloc said in Indiana Jones, some people consider some archaeologists to have strayed from the true faith. And I'm not quite sure what side of that divide I'm on. But what I do know is that I've always considered public archaeology to be a practice in openness, in being accessible. I remember in the early days of public archaeology in the 2010s, the beginning of the 2010s, you had this desire to even help people simply set up social media presences, Facebook pages, Twitter accounts, so on and so forth, so that people could tell their own archaeological stories. But bit by bit, I've observed, at the very least, a shift towards, ironically enough, it being a specialism, and the idea that archaeology comms can only be done by certain people. And this really came to a head in recent weeks and months surrounding the biggie, Stonehenge, here in the UK. And hence, I think Steph is going to be an interesting third voice here, an observer. And I guess, Andy, I'm going to hand over to you. And do you want to lay out some context for our conversation today?
Yeah, and I'll start by laying my cards on the table.
Hmm.
It's my personal belief is that all archaeology should be public archaeology. There's no
Hmm.
point in doing it if we don't share it.
Hmm.
And what we're talking about really today is how we share it. And we're using a medium that we've been using regularly for years now, which is YouTube.
Uh-huh.
And the YouTube long form format, conversational format. It's a very similar format. And I know we've had this discussion before about whether or not this is a podcast or a vodcast or what it is. It's a conversation. And
Hmm.
it's a conversation between us, and it's a conversation that our audience can overhear, but crucially, our audience can also interact with.
Hmm.
And as always, we invite people to comment below the line. If they want to produce their own content to discuss our content, that's absolutely fine. That's the game we're all playing.
Hmm. Hmm.
So that's where I'm starting from. Um, Obviously, I'm also looking at this from a point of view of an investigator, an investigative writer, an investigative journalist. We can argue about what it is that I actually do when I'm doing a significant investigation for the pipeline, like we did, for example, with Mast over the Prince of Wales and Repulse.
Hmm.
And we've done in the past over, for example, the issues around higher education, archaeology, higher education, and the attempts of some bodies within archaeology to control messages and
Hmm.
control campaigns,
Hmm.
which was, shall we say, somewhat controversial when we did it.
Well, it was another
So
it was another milestone along this journey, really, and I think that conversation. I don't know if Steph was particularly aware of it or party to it, but that conversation surrounded the so-called Save British Archaeology campaign, run by a citizen, private citizen, and also a politician, who seemingly wanted to do good, made a couple of wrong steps in terms of media appearances, ill-advised, for example, appearing on Neil Oliver's show, given that he's an archaeologist of controversial reputation.
not, I think so. I think it's only fair to say, but wasn't as controversial at that time. He hadn't
No,
completely
no,
gone
no,
fully left field conspiracy
no,
theory,
no.
to the extent that he's actually been dropped by GB News now. So,
Oh, has he? Wow. Okay. Wow. But the point is, though, is that the reaction from, it's public record. We reported on it. The CBA, CIFA, and others was basically to shut it down and to try and claim that space. But then, ironically enough, not go on to really use it. At the time, Neil Redfern was the head of the CBA, was talking about how he had a plan. He had a campaign for public archaeological awareness of higher education and the threat to university departments, and nothing happened. And I guess that's a pattern that we have seen replicated in the case of Stonehenge.
we're speaking at the end of the week when the government in Parliament announced that it was cancelling the 1.2 billion, some people say it's more, project to build a tunnel and dual carriageway across the Stonehenge and Avebury World Heritage Site, which had been a green light up until just a few days ago. And with that, according to the press releases, £35 million worth of archaeology.
Now, rather than us describing Stonehenge again, let's hand over to our wonderful guest. And would you like to talk about how you feel about what you've observed surrounding this situation? Because it's interesting, as you've been pointing out as well, what the reaction, in some ways, a quiet reaction has been to your observations.
And just sorry, Steph, just sorry to cut across you, but just for context, and particularly for our viewer who maybe isn't in the UK.
I feel like I have a weird position as an observer because I did work, for a few months before COVID, I did work in commercial archaeology. So I am in that way kind of familiar with the way that it works and that kind of construction side of things. But I found the reaction from archaeologists to the Stonehenge, I think you can argue whether it's right or wrong if something needs to be done. And I felt like when I posted my video about it, it was done as more of a criticism of the archaeologists themselves, not exactly what was necessarily being said. I'm like, personally, I don't really care about Stonehenge. I'm not, I have a British passport, but I'm not English, but I know it's very attached to a national identity. It's very strong in that way. And so I can respect people that do have it. But there is a part of me that's as an archaeologist, I'd be fascinated if people were to dig there and see what would come up. There is that kind of, I feel, I don't know if all archaeologists have this, but that sort of innate desire and that curiosity to find out what's out there. But when I didn't even really know about this Stonehenge debate thing going on. Genuinely, I didn't know about it at all until there was in Badger, there was it was posted, sign this petition for I can't remember what was said actually about it, but it was some petition. They were like, oh my gosh, everyone totally has to sign this. Archaeologists need to band together. And I was like, yes, I am here for archaeologists to band together. What are we doing about it? And then I read it. I was going to sign it. I had almost typed my name in. And I read it, and I went, I don't know how blunt you want me to be about what my first thoughts were. Maybe they're a bit too...
blunt.
I was like, really? I'm sorry. Are you really upset that people aren't respecting you? And look, don't get me wrong. I think commercial archaeology is under-respected because I think people don't know what commercial archaeologists do. And archaeology in general deserves so much more respect. But why is that? Why don't people know what we do? Why isn't there respect for what archaeologists do? Why do we have certain reputations as an industry? I'll never forget when I first started in commercial archaeology. And even though I might get accused of doing drugs semi-regularly on my account because I've got large pupils, I've never done drugs. And I always remember my first day, people were being like, "Oh yeah, if you think you're gonna like fail a drug test on a construction site, just ask the guy who's in charge and he'll move you around." And I was like, "Wait, what?" People like I was kind of really innocent going into it. I was like, "What do you mean?" They went, "Oh yeah, archaeologists have a reputation for being like drug addicts," and I was like, "We do?" Huh? I
Okay.
was like, "What?"
Right.
Like that was kind of how I was introduced to archaeology or commercial archaeology, which wasn't fair to the many amazing archaeologists that I had the pleasure of working beside. Um, I wasn't seeing, there wasn't like there was drug use everywhere on the side. Like, everyone was very professional. But I found the debate really, I mean, I don't even know if is it a debate if I don't know about it? Like, and I'm like, look, if I don't know about it, someone who I feel like I'm on, I mean, here's the thing, I'm not really on Twitter. And I feel like a lot of these conversations are happening on Twitter. Like, even when I did my post, I had a colleague, someone that I know, reach out to me and be like, hey, like, archaeologists were talking on Twitter, but like, people weren't listening and talking them down. And I went, maybe that's the problem. Maybe you're just sat on Twitter. Because there was the comment made, like, how do you argue with someone who doesn't want to listen? And it's like, well, you don't. And I've never approached my content that way. Like, one of the reasons I started posting was because it was the only archaeology I was seeing on TikTok in 2019 was pseudo archaeology. And I literally remember sitting there going, well, if they can do it, so can I. If they can post about pseudo archaeology, I can post about real archaeology. I was always of the belief that if I simply present real archaeology, real history, sort of the actual stuff that's going on, then that would be respected in some way. And I hope to some extent that that's happened. But I just found it very odd that someone like me, who is, probably a little too active on social media, didn't know about this. And I'm like, if I don't know, how is someone who's less involved going to know about it? Or people outside the UK, for example.
Yeah, I think it's you've raised some really interesting issues there, which I think perhaps certainly the few that I'd like to come back to as we chat. Again, just for clarity for our viewer, we are talking about the so-called open letter, which was initially published, I think, on Badge of the British Archaeology Jobs for Source, which is basically a Facebook group where very many archaeologists, principally but not entirely from the developer-funded sector, gather to talk and chew the fat, and also look for jobs and ask each other for advice and so on. So it's a very important archaeological social media resource. But as saying on that particular occasion, it was one of the platforms that was used to mobilize archaeological opinion for this so-called open letter. We'll link to the open letter as part of the as part of the content below the line, because it is worth having a look at so that you know what we're actually talking about. But I mean, Marc, you haven't had a chance to pitch in much yet.
Well,
where are you on all this?
I mean, the thing is obviously, I have discussed this elsewhere, but I think coming back to this notion of what I ideally hoped archaeologists were about in terms of public communication, but also in a broader sort of way, best practice was and still is. I still believe that best practice is. I believe to if you don't have to dig something, you don't. Best practice is preservation in situ.
In situ.
And I think what I found fascinating about the publication of an open letter, we can speculate on who authored it. We think we possibly know who the small group of people who possibly authored it, but unless it was anonymous, and we had some key signatures at the bottom pushing it very early on, for example on the Badger forum and on Twitter and elsewhere. What I found weird about it was the way that it was advocating for a government project, and that's fine. Archaeologists don't have to be anti-government. It was advocating for a civil engineering project, and that's fine. Archaeologists don't have to be anti-civil engineering. But it was pushing for it in the context of, and trying to make the argument in some ways, that this archaeological opportunity was one to grab with both hands. In another context, one might say opportunity to showcase one's skills. Now, that is not why you dig. as far as my understanding goes. And the only comparison I could come up with at the time, I'll hand over to you in a second, Andy, was if you are a medical professional or a surgeon advocating for unnecessary surgery in a public space so you can show off how good you are with the scalpel. That's not good archaeology. And I was quite astonished by where the conversation went, what the open letter encouraged, especially in terms of dismissing words like desecration or modern public perception of Stonehenge, pagan communities or neo-pagan communities, but also this idea that the opportunity was one to pursue before the project was even actually fully greenlit. And we should be clear, this project was never fully greenlit. It was always being contested. And so that's more or less where I found myself very conflicted. Andy, what were we going to say there?
Well, yeah. Again, just for clarity, the one of the not subtext, and one of the actual aims of the open letter. First of all, yes, it was to reinforce the idea that archaeologists are professionals and were going to do a fantastic job, and there is absolutely no denying that. I think where some people, myself including, and you as well, from what you've just said, and I think probably I don't want to preempt what Steph's going to say, but I suspect we might have some level of agreement here. Was that it was trying to other opponents of the project who weren't archaeologists. It was trying to say, in a sense, Mother knows best. And I think in an archaeological context, particularly when we spend so much of our time talking about public archaeology and the importance of archaeology and heritage in identity and placemaking and so on. Stakeholders and all the rest of it, trying to other those stakeholders for having a different opinion to the one that you hold was a sort of slippery slope that maybe we ought to have thought not just once, twice, but several times before going down. And I say it. The main thing, and it's what you've just alluded to, that I'm not against a tunnel under the Stonehenge and Avebury World Heritage Site if it is of an appropriate length with appropriate mitigations in place and it is legal, decent, honest and truthful. And as you just said, the Stonehenge project never was. It was always controversial. It was, at the time the open letter came out, it was in the process of being found unlawful. And I think it's a very dangerous thing for archaeologists not to see the wider context, and that for an organisation that prides itself, it often says, on its ethics through organisations like the Chartered Institute for Archaeologists and so on, to be overtly supporting, arguing for, in the worst cases, some people on the opposing side said shilling for a project that was economically highly dubious, and as the government's planning inspectorate found, would cause permanent irrevocable harm to the World Heritage Site and therefore shouldn't go ahead. And I thought, by not seeing that wider context, archaeologists were getting into a very, very questionable ethical place.
Well, it might have been sort of nose to the trench in that sense, too close to it. And so, Steph, what were you going to say?
I mean, I was just going to say that I very much agree with what you guys are saying, because it felt bizarre reading it. Like, I think I had to reread it because I was like, wait, are you guys, like, I was like, am I understanding this correctly? And it felt odd because I was seeing, people that I do respect, people I've spoken, like, people signing it, and I'm sat there going, wait, am I like completely misinterpreting this letter? Because it felt like it went against everything that I've been taught as an archaeologist. Like literally everything. It was like, we're going to align with the construction. That's what it was. It was aligning with this construction industry. And I'm like, in what world have construction people ever cared about archaeologists? Like, there's the whole thing, that they want to get rid of us because they're like, oh, you waste money, we need to stop work because the archaeologists need to come in and do something. And I was reading this going, hang on, even if I agreed with everything else in this letter, even if I was like, actually, I agree with what you're saying, I wouldn't have signed it purely because I was like, hang on, you want me to side with the construction industry and be like, they're the good guys, and everyone else, because, and I felt like it wasn't just a mother knows best. It was a, well, you don't know as much as me. Like, I know more than you. Like, it was like that TikTok audio. I know more than you.
Hi there. Is there a project you're working on? I know more than you. All right.
Yeah.
Like, don't talk to me. Like, how dare a neo-pagan dare come in and have any thoughts about Stonehenge? You know, how dare local people? How dare anyone but an archaeologist? And it was like, but as archaeologists, you're collaborators. Like, there's some irony perhaps in saying that archaeologists weren't looking at the context when that's kind of what archaeology is all about. We're always looking at the context.
Yeah.
But to kind of just be poo-pooing almost everyone else, I was like, what? Like, I don't really care what neo-pagans think about Stonehenge, but don't poo-poo them. Like, you know, when you're taught archaeology, it's engage with stakeholders, talk to the local community. Just because you don't think it's an important religious site doesn't mean other people don't. Yet somehow Stonehenge is exempt from everything archaeologists are taught.
Exactly. And in other contexts, for example, in community-led volunteer digs, archaeologists highlight the weird and wonderful opinions and passions of local people as underpinning the value of their work. In the case, for example, here on Hadrian's Wall, we've had in recent years, actually some academics at Durham University, for example, have been gathering so-called softer, intangible aspects of life on Hadrian's Wall. They may be technically incorrect aspects, i.e. A story about a hole somewhere where a monster might have once supposedly lived and blah, 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 blah. But they were being gathered so as to add to the richness of the landscape. And also, frankly, as the landscape as it's used today. And I think it has been a key issue surrounding Stonehenge that's absolutely gone over so many of our colleagues' heads, even very prominent colleagues, such as, for example, the sainted Alice Roberts. She and others seem to forget that for most people, this was not a project about archaeology.
It was never a project about archaeology. It was a road project that archaeology happened to be attached to because it had to be for the planning system.
Exactly, yeah. There was legally mandated mitigation. And that's it. For most people, Stonehenge is an unknown. That's the other thing as well. You know, people can visit. One of my favourite visits to Stonehenge I've ever seen was on YouTube. And if anyone out there watches the Abroad in Japan channel, there's this very eccentric chap called Natsuki. And he comes to Stonehenge and he's talking about wizards and druids. And he sees like a bird on the stones and says, you know, mystical bird. Wow. And I loved it. And the thing is, I know when I was a student prehistorian, I might have been like, oh no, tell him the truth. But actually what was important was that he was interacting with this thing today in its full cultural context. And that cultural context, that civil engineering context, that commuting to work context, that farming context is not one that archaeologists own or indeed deserve to be listened to about in that sense, because this was always bigger than this. And can I? And just one final point on that softer elements though. In other contexts, as for example at Hadrian's Wall, Natsuki's opinion of Stonehenge would be folded into a sort of a broader stakeholders narrative about a project. In this instance, that open letter was explicitly shutting it down, and I found that to be disappointing. Andy, go on.
Again, it's just a quick comment really for context. And that is when archaeology tries to talk to the mainstream media, news programs, that kind of newspapers, news outlets, it is sometimes, it's getting better at it. And some people are very good at it, but often it's not good at talking human. It talks about stakeholders rather than communities and people who live in this.
We're talking amongst ourselves here.
Yeah, well, that's partly the problem. Yeah. That's part of the problem. We spend too much time talking to ourselves and maybe not enough time talking in the language that people outside of archaeology actually use when we're wanting to communicate. And we have to, and we start off saying we have to communicate. But no, I just wanted to throw in just one other very quick example of this. Just again, last night watching the news, the National Trust of Clearly or his Historic England English Heritage have put out a story that the sycamore gap tree on Hadrian's Wall is putting out, that was felled illegally last year, is putting out shoots from its stump, and which may turn into a viable replacement tree. That is almost a mythologized site now. It was culturally significant because it appeared in the Robin Hood Prince of Thieves movie. It became incredibly well known, and then for reasons which are still subject to legal proceedings, it was felled, and there was a national outcry about it. And that is a human interest story, or an environmental story that ordinary people can really get a handle on. People felt moved by it, and yes, it was about damage to a scheduled ancient monument, but actually it was also about damage to the national psyche. And archaeologists need to recognise those things. Both those things can be true.
Well, Steph, on that psychological aspect, what do you feel about the fact that the colleagues were complaining that there was a misunderstanding that the tunnel was going under the stones or might damage the stones? Because in that sense, the Sycamore Gap tree is archaeology adjacent in the same way that this tunnel was archaeology adjacent. But do you think that there's a legitimate point about broader communications about the tunnel, or do you think that's actually, again, on archaeologists to do that?
I mean, I feel like even that point you were making about it being on archaeologists, because I regularly hear specifically senior academics are like, it's not my responsibility to be doing this kind of public archaeology and telling people about things. Like, that's not my role. And to be fair, I think I sympathize. I mean, I don't think anyone is going to disagree with the fact that senior academics, if you're a senior, you're being overworked. If you're in universities, you're overworked. And I think it is true that if you want to do this public engagement, it is a job. It is difficult if you want to be doing that outreach. And so I feel like as archaeologists, there needs to be, if we want to be doing more public engagement, if we want to be going out there, then there needs to be a recognition. And I feel like I am seeing this from, at least the commercial side of things, and even from universities, that this is an actual job. Like at Durham University, they got a social media intern because they wanted to promote more on like TikTok and on Instagram. And, I think that that's really important to recognize this.
But it's still an internship, though.
What?
It's still an internship, though.
Yeah, still an internship. Yeah. I mean, because I think it's only like 4 hours a week, something like that. I know. I looked at the job posting. I considered applying for it, and then I went, nah.
I mean, it's not like you got other things to do.
No.
Comms isn't easy. Not everybody can do it. Not everybody wants to do it.
No.
And increasingly, there are different platforms, different mediums that require different inputs, different content, differently framed content. Technically, logistically, verbally, written, whatever. And you're there. You're doing a PhD, but you also have this online life, promoting content that you produce through the platforms that you've chosen to engage with. So what made you amid all the stresses of doing a PhD, why develop the sideline? What do you think it gives you? What do you think it gives the people who consume your content?
I started it because I was working in commercial archaeology, living in a youth hostel. I mean, I've not deleted it. I've been on the platform. It'll be 5 years in November was when the first video was up there. So I have been on I was there before the great COVID rush, just beforehand, but beforehand. So I've seen it grow. I've seen it change. I've seen a lot happen on that app. But the reason I started it was because I was bored and I wanted to entertain myself. I fundamentally, the content I make is because it's fun. It's a hobby. I don't think you guys, you sort of have an understanding of social media and how that works. But anyone in social media, understands when I say, oh yeah, I've posted one video a day on TikTok for 5 years. Well, more than it. I think it was, what was it? Something like September last year, so a year ago, I was at like 4,700 videos because TikTok had one of those updates where it told you how many videos you posted, and it gave me a heart attack, and I went, oh my gosh, I need to reevaluate what do you mean I've posted? I mean, it was in less than 4 years, I'd posted almost 5,000 videos.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you ask anyone, that's insane. Like, let's not go into my addiction, but let's blame COVID and just being very bored and with nothing to do. And so I could post 8 videos, 10 videos a day. So let's just say that's what it is. But ultimately, it's to be entertaining for myself. And I distinctly remember when I first started posting on TikTok thinking, archaeology is so niche. No one's going to care about this, because I didn't I didn't know that public archaeology was a thing. I didn't know there were people on social media. Like, I went through a whole ass degree. Like, I was volunteered on sites. I was working in commercial archaeology. I didn't know that there were archaeologists on YouTube. I didn't know there were archaeologists on Instagram. It just was never a world. So it was kind of funny when I started producing content. People were like, oh, so you watch this person and that person? And I was like, I got no idea. Like, I genuinely didn't even know who Alice Roberts was until, I want to say, maybe 2 years ago. Never heard of, because I was like studying archaeology, and so in my free time I don't necessarily want to consume archaeology content all the time. Like, I want that, separation of church and state.
Yeah, husband's holiday. Yep.
Yeah, a little bit.
Yep.
And it is difficult, and that's, partially why I didn't apply for that internship, because I went, you know what, the skills I have are more than an internship. And that was kind of a moment where I stood back, because I was going to apply for it, because money's money. But I kind of went, hang on a second, I've been posting on this app for 5 years. I remember deciding to make the hashtag archaeology TikTok because I didn't like the sound of archaeology talk. And I'd seen History Talk had a hashtag. And I was like, oh, well, if History Talk's got a hashtag, why shouldn't archaeologists? So, I probably wasn't the first person to do, but I distinctly remember making the decision to be like, I want to use hashtag archaeology TikTok. I think we should have our own hashtag. So I've been there since before most creators were on there. There were definitely people beforehand. There were people, before me on YouTube, in blogs, on Instagram, definitely. But specifically for TikTok, that I feel that's an ecosystem that I'm very familiar with now, because I feel like I have been there since its inception, like, since the very, very early days. And I don't think people necessarily respect the work that goes into public archaeology. It's like, oh, like even a TikTok video, so many times people will be like, oh, we just film a video. And I even thought that way. And it wasn't until I was having an interview with someone who was doing research on creators who were students specifically. And she was like, okay, like how long does it take you to film a video? Like a 15-second TikTok. And I went, oh, well, 15 seconds to film the video. And she was like, okay, but like, what about the research beforehand? What about the time spent looking for audios? What about writing the caption? What about maybe like actually proofreading your captions so they're not grammatically incoherent, as I seem to lack that ability? Choosing hashtags, then the time that's spent engaging, because you can't just post on social media. You have, social media, you don't post in a vacuum. You need a community around you, and I'm so thankful to have discovered a community. And I sort of I remember like I was in this chair and I sat there and I was like, hang on, how long do I spend on a video? Like, you think 15 seconds and I'm like, okay, but there are so many trends that, because, I like to talk about certain topics, or I often hear an audio and I'm like, oh my gosh, I have a really great idea. Like, I was like, there's this audio, I think it would work really well if I was to make a post about domestic violence. So here I am trying to look for the evidence of domestic violence in ancient history. And I've realized how many topics it's really difficult to research about. Yeah. And I eventually found a blog post, I think, or maybe like an article from the 70s about 2 Roman headstones, about 2 women, or one was more a girl than a woman, who were murdered by their husbands. And it was the text on them. But again, like, I feel like if you were just to if you didn't have the research skills I've developed, having now done a PhD, you learn where to look for info, how to find it, how to search. That is a skill in and of itself. I would probably have not found it. And to be honest, that searching probably took me a good 2 hours, if not longer, possibly. And then it's that trying to think, how are you going to write the captions? So I showed my mum, because we were just on holiday, sort of how I write the captions. She's like, Stephanie, but that's not 100% grammatically correct. And I went, it doesn't matter. I have to put at the beginning of the text that it was 3,000 years ago. Don't put the date. Don't put 1,245 BC or BCE, whatever dating system you want to use. Do some rounds up and make the numbers sound good. Say it was 3,000 years ago. Say it was 2,000 years ago. Because I've personally noticed if I do that to my caption, that the video will do better. Versus if I put blah, 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 blah happened 3,000 years ago. If I, and it's those random little things that you learn doing social media that, I didn't start this intending to be a public archaeologist. I didn't even know what that was. I didn't even know that was a thing. I just started posting because I wanted to and because I felt compelled to, because I was like, there's so much misinformation on TikTok. I felt like it was a responsibility on my part to do that communication.
Can I pick you up on that point, Steph? Because it's something you mentioned earlier as well, and it's something I'm really interested in, have been for a long time, and it's particularly pertinent again in the UK at the moment because of the arguments that are going on about whether the unrest we're seeing in some British cities at the moment are down to misinformation passed on online through platforms like X, Twitter, and Telegram, and so on. Because you mentioned the amount of one of the things that got you into it was the amount of pseudo archaeology, the amount of misinformation out there. Do you think basically archaeologists missed a trick? We're playing catch up now, which is of course very difficult to do.
I think social media is changing so much that I wouldn't necessarily say missed a trick, but I feel very quickly being left behind. I feel people are definitely now, I definitely see this expanding. You're seeing more Instagram accounts, I'm seeing more content. I was noticing recently actually Cotswold Archaeology on Instagram, they've been putting out some really great videos sort of about excavation and everything and kind of showing that more work, which I think is really good. But I still feel sometimes I'm not just saying this to be mean to anyone. This isn't necessarily attacking any people or the way they create content. Because as I said, it's difficult. It's not an innate ability. As has been said, you don't have a right to someone's attention just because you are an archaeologist. You have to earn that by ultimately being entertaining. And maybe, I don't know, is that not what people want to hear? They're like, but I'm a serious academic. I should be able to sit here and be like, you don't, this is the facts. This is how it's laid out. I don't know, people talk about the lack of, concentration people have now. I'm like, give me stuff in 15 seconds. Give me it in 6 seconds. Communicate to me something in this short period of time. I rarely watch long form content, if any. I never watch the news. I don't have a TV. I watch Netflix and scroll through TikTok. That's just what I do. And that's what I do. And I assume that's many people of my generation and generations either side also are doing. But I certainly wouldn't want this to be a complete negative, like that's it, you've got no hope, pseudo-archaeology's won, don't even attempt with social media. But I think if you choose to do social media, you have to recognize you're entertaining, which means you have to choose your presenters carefully, because it is PR, it is marketing. Doing social media, I've taught myself a marketing degree, essentially. I feel like you have to learn how to advertise yourself. You have to learn how to advertise archaeology. And that's not easy. That's why there's whole marketing degrees and people go on and do masters about it,
So in that sense,
but,
so in that sense, the application of those skills, the application of and obviously, you're talking about your experience since 2019, doing TikTok, etc. I remember having very similar conversations starting back in 2010 and through about YouTube, but one of the things was like, how on earth are you going to make any money? What's the point of this kind of thing. But and I, dear reader, I still don't make much money.
Dear reader, can I just point out most archaeologists don't make much money, for example, from the publications that they're forced to write for, which go behind paywalls, and you have to pay $30 for an 8-page article, which the author sees absolutely nothing.
Yeah. Also, you can ask authors for PDFs as well. They're often quite helpful. But the point is, though, is that this bridging between specialized knowledge, I guess, and an element of specialized knowledge, and a curious public, is one that does require some element of experience and, as you say, understanding that it's not. In some instances, you can do a long form when people are expecting a lecture. In other instances, if you just want to get a fact across and surprise and delight, then entertainment, pure 15, 60-second entertainment is absolutely the way to go. I think that instinct, what you've just been describing, is a learned skill. But bringing it back to what got us three talking, basically, and what's got you and me talking in messages, Steph, as well. Is that a skill that seemingly was demonstrably missing and has been missing from the, as has been described? I won't quote exactly who said this, where they said it, or what exactly they said, but paraphrasing. The idea of a vocal, self-appointed minority creating these sort of sugar rush, intense hits of publicity that actually have no plan behind them and have no expertise surrounding them. So, for example, in the case of the open letter about Stonehenge, that could have been really impactful, even if it was written anonymously because people were living in fear of losing their jobs or something because of client confidentiality, whatever. It could have been really impactful if it was part of a campaign and had some associated media, maybe had some follow-up intention, and the use of the word mandate was floated around, but it was a completely wasted mandate. Now, the thing is, I didn't support the goals of it, but the stated goals and intentions of it, sorry. But the issue is, what we have there is some of the usual suspects in archaeology not knowing when to keep their powder dry, and by implication, not knowing when to actually set off and about which issues to set off a firework, or to ask for help from the public, or to try and raise attention, or try and inform and maybe even entertain. I was saying to you guys before we were recording, in that sense, before we were recording this element, this part of the video, but I don't just want to be tearing things down here. I genuinely want to see archaeologists doing better. But how can they, if we're not going to be in that group of people who launch these things every now and then, how can they learn these skills and become better at it, and not just sort of because we've seen a couple of big sort of pushes. I won't name them again. I don't want to be bitching and moaning about them per se, but or seen as bitching and moaning about them. But we've seen a couple of really big pushes. The Stonehenge letter being really the second or third one. That was a rush, and lots of our colleagues were signing, and there was a hashtag, and yes, and then just nothing. How can we become more effective? And how can we help? Maybe this is where public archaeology is also an aspect of service, not just to the public, but also to our colleagues. How can we help our colleagues improve rather than feeling as though they're always behind the curve? Clamoring for attention as opposed to proactively informing.
Can I make just one very brief point about the as we're using it as a case study, and again, we're not attacking individuals. People did what they felt was right. But if you take Stonehenge as a case study, all sides, pro, anti, neutral, coming from a transport focus, coming from a natural environment focus, coming from an archaeological focus, everybody was using various comms platforms, to use the jargon, to get across arguments. I think one of the reasons archaeologists got very annoyed with the Stonehenge Alliance was that the Stonehenge Alliance, which included professional archaeologists as well as neo-pagans and others in its supporter base, was very good at placing press articles, TV stories, and so on, using the media. I've had dealings with their press operation. They were very good at it, and I think some archaeologists were finding that was almost sort of unfair. That they're getting these stories in the media, and we're not, and that's not fair because we're professional archaeologists. People should be listening to us, and that's what you were saying earlier about having to earn an audience, but also having to use the right medium, the right platform, to get your argument in front of the audience. And one of the reasons, and it was mentioned in the discussion in professional archaeology, one of the problems that the main quote, for want of a better word, mainstream developer-funded archaeology view had was, as many people acknowledged, because of commercial confidentiality, they weren't allowed to engage with the arguments, which is absurd. The archaeology has allowed itself to get into that situation where it's relying on the comms operation run by Highways England and the government to get its arguments across, or just nibble away at the edges with something like the open letter, which I think in the end, laudable though its aims were in many respects, controversial in others, but in the end it attracted just a few thousand people primarily from within the sector. It was talking to itself.
No, but the point is that that's been seen as and painted as a massive success.
Huh?
It has.
I'm sorry, that's such an honest reaction.
No, exactly. That's the thing.
People thought that was a success?
Yes, and people were patting themselves on the back about it. Again, I don't want to name individuals, but if you look on Twitter, you'll see them going, "Wonderful, great," and this is where I got the quote, you creating a mandate from. There was a genuine idea that this has been a huge success. We're going to tell people that they're wrong, to shut up, get out of our way. We know best. We're archaeologists. We have a mandate now. And yet, as you say, I'm not quite sure what the numbers are now, but it's definitely not tens of thousands.
But also, no one knows. As you said, Andy, it was definitely it was being shared around, archaeology circles that I'm a part of. There was archaeologists talking about it. I looked at the names on the list, and people were predominantly archaeologists, to be blunt. So what, it didn't.
I mean, to be fair, it made it onto. Yeah, I mean, I think to be fair, it briefly made it onto the made it as a story on the BBC West website. But apart from that, there was very little pickup from the mainstream media outlets.
I think a subdivision of the BBC and I think possibly the Sunday Times picked up on it.
Oh yeah. I vaguely remember that it being part of stuff. But I mean, I think I agree though with your points about what can this mean for almost a marketing perspective, how could it have been better? But now I'm concerned that if people think that that's a success, how do you tell people, look, hey, I don't necessarily agree with your petition, but I could have run it better. You could have done so much more with it.
Well, but also in that sense, how do you effectively lobby for better pay and conditions? How do you effectively, make an argument for keeping aspects of the planning system in place to Whitehall when they, I mean, some of the numbers that have been thrown around in previous campaigns about the value of archaeology, as Andy has said, amount to a rounding up error in Westminster. People don't. Politicians and civil servants don't speak and don't have to respect your specialism. You have to be able to communicate it to the people, and that has to start presumably with better communication about the value of archaeology to the public as well. Because the public are voters, but also the public ultimately send their kids off to university. And if they're not convinced that archaeology is worth doing, not least because it doesn't pay very well, then you're not going to get your next generation of archaeologists. It feels like people backslapping over a very self-righteous rush of enthusiasm, defending an ever shrinking molehill, and not actually having a plan for how to bring people into the profession and give them a solid career path, a plan for how to communicate the value of archaeology such that actually it wasn't even up for debate whether or not the archaeology would be, decent surrounding the Stonehenge monument, and also not being so desperate for these things to be recognised that you end up arguing, as I was hinting at before, for essentially unnecessary surgery. It's a confidence issue, I think, as much as a communications issue. Sorry, Andy.
When we're working out how to respond to issues, how campaigning of any kind, Ofcom, the Office of Communications, which is the UK's broadcasting regulator, every year produces an annual study into what it calls the nation's media habits. And this, again, it just so happens that a few days ago, this year's report came out, and it is really stark in terms of where to aim our arrows, if you like, as a sector. For example,
And also the need
20
to clear your browser history. Sorry, go on.
Yeah. No, I mean, look, one of the things that Ofcom found was, for example, 16 to 24s watch just 20 minutes of live TV per day. That's a third of an episode of Dig for Britain, the flagship archaeology program on the BBC. Now, people might watch it on catch up because more people watch catch up on things like the BBC iPlayer, ITVX, and the other catch up services. But the report also poses the question: is YouTube taking over TV? Because overall, people have been watching around 4 hours 31 minutes of video content per day, which is up on previous years, and a lot of that is on video sharing platforms. So is that where we should be concentrating? We've talked about TikTok, and apparently again they found that the TV at home is still a place where people come together to watch content, but they're now watching primarily the streaming services, the video platforms and so on. They're not watching traditional linear TV. And that's before we get on to the fact that Rupert Murdoch has predicted that print newspapers have probably got 15 years, if we're lucky, before they disappear completely.
Well, yeah, absolutely, and that is an issue, but I think in tandem with that question as to where to send your arrows and where to put hoist your flags and do your messaging, I think also we all need to get better at accepting that no one group of people owns the narrative. Actually, in so much as I think what. Maybe I'm misunderstanding, but I think what Steph was sort of hinting at there was this idea of, do you want to give people who seem to completely miss the point as to seemingly professional standards an element of critical thinking and decent public communication and what success actually is in the context of that campaign, tips on how to campaign better? Or should we as a profession be getting better initially at recognising how it is we want to talk to each other and talk to the public? To be blunt, this video will not be shared in certain forums. We know this because certain archaeologists don't like hearing this stuff. And I'm not saying that in a conspiratorial way. I'm saying it because I think it's a shame. And if we can't share in ideas via media with each other in an effective way, and we can't have open conversations with each other, and we can't boil incredibly complex topics, not least linked with the legality of civil engineering projects that may well affect arguably the most famous archaeological site on the planet, possibly the second most famous, then then how can we possibly expect to be able to have professional, engaging, entertaining, human conversations with the public? That's ultimately the thing that I think concerns me most, is the way that we both are inwards looking, but we're not terribly good at truly being collaborative across bubbles and barriers that have been set up for various reasons, that may well have their roots in the semi-professional nature or the amateur nature of archaeology, individual units not working with other units, this kind of thing, who knows. I'm concerned about that because in that sense, as we talked about, people like Ellis Roberts have a platform, but they were seemingly really missing a key point of what I consider to be best practice about archaeology, and that is, engage with people who aren't archaeologists. Accept that Stonehenge isn't just your baby, and in the case of Stonehenge in particular, accept that you don't deserve to be listened to. It's a real. I mean, do you have any thoughts on that, Steph?
I mean, I just think I really agree with what you're saying. I think this is quite a complicated topic, because I think it's not, in some ways, it's not about Stonehenge.
No.
It feels like that's maybe just been the catalyst for whatever this is, but it's actually not. There's so many wider issues that this touches on. I feel like, you can talk about things even like trying to campaign for better pay. Like, that to me felt like almost the worst thing. Like, what do you mean you want me to sign some petition to be like, let's dig up Stonehenge, but there's no petitions going around to be like, let's pay archaeologists a living wage so they can afford to eat. So archaeologists can afford to attend their own Christmas party. Like, in some ways I was like, I don't care if you dig or don't dig up Stonehenge. I care that people can't afford to eat. We as an industry need to come together to sign this petition to align with the construction industry, but we're not going to do a petition or even attempt something really about the pay of archaeologists. The fact that when I started in commercial, I was on 17 whatever, £1,000 a year. That, the reason I partially started TikTok was because I couldn't afford to do anything on the weekends, because I was saving to rent, because I started work with literally 200 quid in the bank account. Like, or you can go back through my account, and those early videos are all filmed in the bathroom of the youth hostel I lived in, or because I couldn't afford. And, when there was the report done by Badger that was, in some ways that report feels like my Roman Empire, that I think about it so often, and some of the quotes from archaeologists in there, and I'll never forget one of them being something along the lines of, I am doing well in archaeology, I have kind of made it, but what was something like, I cannot in good conscience recommend archaeology as a degree to anyone. And that really, was like a gut punch, because I do have people asking, I go live, I have people asking me these questions, I have people in my DMs going from all around the world, do you recommend what do you recommend? And I kind of sit there and go, I don't think in good conscience I can say absolutely full steam ahead. No. Like, I certainly say, look, if it is what you're passionate about, you're willing to go for it. But it felt like, again, probably, the money issue has been an issue for much longer than I've been part of archaeology, or probably even before I was born. So it's not a unique issue. But I felt kind of frustrating that this was the PR that people wanted to focus on, that this was the most pressing issue in archaeology. This was the highest thing, that people were being mean to archaeologists and didn't respect them and weren't listening to them. And I was like, maybe if we weren't all, struggling to eat, maybe if so many archaeologists weren't relying on food banks, maybe if we were being paid appropriately for the expertise which we would bring to a project like Stonehenge, the Stonehenge Tunnel, that we could have more of the energy to be concerned with public outreach and be concerned with what our perception is to the public. Because people are interested in archaeology. I mean, my account is surely evidence. The many accounts that have come up about archaeologists and the engaged followings across, all social media platform you can think of, there is an archaeologist posting. And I think it's a disservice to the public to in some ways dismiss that and be like, and that's what it felt like that letter was. It was like, you don't know enough. And it's like, but that goes against everything I believe in posting the videos that I do, that I want to bring value. I want to make people think. I want to engage the public. And this is my own way of creating engagement.
Archaeology is almost unique in the sectors active in the environmental realm, which we are. We're, natural environment, historic environment. It's just the environment. And we're involved in environmental mitigation in terms of developer funded work. But of our leading sector bodies, two of them, CBA, which seeks to engage across the entire sector, public, commercial, academic, it's the Council for British Archaeology collectively.
Well, and also being a transition between government and the public as well. So,
absolutely, it was set up. It's set up 80 years ago, like the Arts Council was, to act as a bridge and and an advocate. And the Chartered Institute for Archaeologists. Now, this may be about to change under the new. Under its new director, chief executive, as we discussed in a previous watching brief. But up until now, those two organisations were loath to get involved in any significant public campaigning on any archaeological issue. And there are reasons for that, which we can discuss, and they will probably put forward. But it's not what we see from, for example, the National Trust Council to promote rural England and always RSPB and so on. One organisation, the Federation of Archaeological Managers and Employers, which actively doesn't want archaeologists to be engaged in campaigning in case it would appear, in case it causes problems with their clients in the construction and development industry. That in a sense, we've put on and tied up our own straitjacket, and that's before we get into issues of, Steph mentioned Cotswold archaeology and producing TikToks and so on. A lot of units do that. What they don't do is get involved in anything that it could be seen as editorial comment, because again, they're worried about client confidentiality and appearing to be on one side or other of a contentious issue. They're seeking to rise above, if you like, and sail serenely across the surface of some quite controversial issues. And I think that's where, that's what happened at Stonehenge. You had a coming together of, commercial units that said they couldn't speak, but people advocating for them from the outside, from within the sector, with connections to those units. And the unspoken thing in the whole controversy in terms of archaeological support was that there were 35 million reasons why some archaeologists wanted the project to go ahead, regardless of whether it was lawful or not, it would appear.
Which comes back to that idea of if your sector is starving, of course they're gonna run for the golden goose. The problem is that the golden goose
Absolutely.
it is so whimsical. HS2 didn't fulfill that. Stonehenge Tunnel has collapsed. Well, thankfully it didn't get a chance to collapse, but you know what I mean? So again, in the spirit not so much of tearing down, but rather of genuinely wanting to see change. Because you say, Steph, this has been going on since before, it's been going on so if I count my career as from when I graduated, it's been going on for about, since then at least. And the same issues still aren't being addressed. There's still this question of, well, how can we, we're only small, we're only this, we're only that. And yet every now and then having this righteous fury when we are treated like we're only this, we're only that, when we are treated as though we're a small consideration. And I don't believe archaeology is a small consideration. I think, as you say, Steph, people love it. I've never got into a taxi and not had the person say to me, "Oh, I've always wanted to be an archaeologist, me. Oh, it's lovely. What have you found? What's the best thing you've ever found?" And I'd be like, "Oh, well, it was a Viking toilet, actually."
Oh.
Yeah. Sorry, Andy, what were you going to say?
And again, just for perspective, and it's my last point on this, and again, it's all about comms. I'm, as I've said many times before, probably, I'm old enough to remember the Rose Theatre controversy. And on that occasion, that put archaeology at the centre of development, because it was a massive screw up to and involving the cabinet of the country, the government of the country. That's why we've got developer funded archaeology now. And on that occasion, archaeologists put their careers on the line to do the right thing there and make sure that the Rose Theatre was preserved. First of all, excavated and then preserved. And I think, and that was done through allyship with particularly the performing arts, because of the connections with Shakespeare. I've talked before about, it was Laurence Olivier's last public appearance was a message to the Rose Theatre campaigners.
Right.
And, so we've got a tradition of doing this stuff really well.
But
when we want to.
Yeah, but seemingly what got in the way, or what got in the way in this instance. Also, I should also say, it wasn't clear outside, as I think as Steph hinted, it wasn't clear outside the profession where archaeologists stood on this. So in the Times, I recently highlighted on my TikTok account, the Times actually said the planning inspectorate, archaeologists, neo-pagans and others were all against the idea of the tunnel. Yet from within UK archaeology, that was not the impression that we were being encouraged to have. So again, it's insular, it's inward looking, and it's
a lack of confidence.
Lack of confidence, and
it's a lack of confidence. But it's people saying, "Oh, we mustn't appear divided. We've got to appear united." You have to face the facts. On something like that, we're not, and we have to embrace that, and then make it positive.
But also, constantly asking the same people, or relying on the same people, to come up with the same answers for the same problems. I just don't think there's much. Something has to change, and hopefully there's a mixture of elements there in terms of being more savvy in terms of communication, having confidence, being willing to campaign on pay and conditions. And for me personally, I would like to see less in the way of key personalities running a sort of a sense of what it is to be an archaeologist. I'd much rather see more voices. One of which, of course, we have with us today.
I was going to say, can I just ask Steph a final question from me? And obviously, you're someone who is far closer to the beginning of your career than the two of us are.
I beg your pardon.
Me more than Mr. Soup.
No, it's okay.
This is a serious question. Obviously, you're at the sharp end of this now. Where?
First of all, sorry. Go on.
What I'd ask you, Steph, is first of all, where you think we are now and where you want to go, and actually where you think we will go.
Oh, that's some big questions that I feel like you could just have a whole watching brief just on that topic.
Yeah. Perhaps you will another time.
Yeah. Oh gosh, I've got the timer going. I think so. I would say the biggest battle has been grappling with myself, because I feel like maybe I've said that I didn't go into posting content to end up being here, to end up being presenting at EAA about this sad girl archaeology thing I've created. It wasn't as if I sat down and went, yes, I'm going to make a career out of this. I mean, who even knows if I've made a career out of it? The lack of funds might suggest otherwise. So in some ways, I feel like I've been grappling with that, looking back on what I've done, seeing what's happened, and then considering where that's going to go to as well. Because I feel like maybe an easy comparison, at least in the realm I see, is the history creators, because there is, even on social media, a slight division between archaeologists and historians. And I feel like in general, I don't know what, the history industry, that section of it, is very engaged with social media creators. I mean, I see many of my peers and friends, they get invited to visit castles, visit sites. There were people who went to premieres of the My Lady Jane TV show that was on Amazon,
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like, and the other thing is there was the histories, 30 Under 30 that Alice Loxton was promoting and working on that with, she's another amazing history creator. And it feels like historians are kind of quite clued in that way, and even their wider industries, there kind of is a recognition of the value that history creators can bring to places, and then to the wider media, to things like TV shows and books and all that other kind of stuff. But I feel like I haven't seen that necessarily from the archaeology side of things. And so that's partially why I decided to do the paper I did, calling it this Sad Girl Archaeology, to kind of actually think about what I was attempting to do and to analyze that, and to be like, hey, in some ways, I'm not creating the sad girl content or that style of content for archaeologists, for professionals. It is for the general public, who thinks Stone Age, Iron Age, Bronze Age, who asks me, which came first, the Bronze Age and the Iron Age.
Yeah.
It's going for that audience, because those are the people who are on social media,
So, just for the folks at home, can you just explain what you mean by sad girl? And also just one additional thought there as well. In what you just described about historians, do you think one of the differences is that historians are accepted as providing a narrative for people, providing a story? Possibly.
Okay, well, I'll start with the sad girl, and then so I can have some time to think about how to answer that. Very, very good question. But so basically, I kind of started going viral on TikTok for looking miserable. I will confess, the first time I was actually kind of miserable. Shout out
I've been miserable for
trains
years.
And Exeter for being rainy. And kind of at least I think it had been a theme I'd been developing like for a while. This kind of looking maybe sad, bittersweet, morose. Looking like I'm about to burst into hysterical sobs, whatever you want to think about it, about different topics in archaeology. And so I won't say that this was the first time I posted it, but in my remembrance of the events, was one of the first times. It's like I went viral, and then it created a series almost. And I film myself, and I do look miserable. It's pinned at the top of my, the video's pinned on my TikTok page of me looking miserable in Exeter Cathedral, looking at graffiti on one of the medievals tombs that's there. The graffiti isn't medieval. I think the oldest date I was seeing was like 1601 or something. Yeah. And I made this very simple video because I didn't want to do anything else, and it was raining, so I sat basically wandering around Exeter Cathedral for 4 hours, literally. And because I'd been on the trains and had to stand up almost all the way from Durham to Exeter was not pleasant. So, I hadn't had a great day the day before, so I was genuinely miserable. And that is one of my highest views. I think I've just had a video past it, but on TikTok that got 7.9 million views, which horrified me at the time, I will say. I was like, what? I look terrible. Why aren't people seeing me when I look nice? Why this video? But that kind of then developed into a series of using the same audio and looking sad. And then it kind of snowballed from there. And so now I often film myself looking morose and slightly sad and get comments of, are you okay? Are you mentally healthy? And I'm like, have you not heard of acting?
Yeah.
Apparently I've had, colleagues or, peers when we met up at events being like, oh yeah, when I told my relative, when I told someone I was going to meet you, they've been like, oh yeah, is she okay? Is she actually okay? Is she okay? And so I have to say here, I am okay. But again, that's partially why I decided to with my wonderful co-authors, Hannah, or I think it's historical Hannah or
I think
historical
so.
Han.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then Charlotte of Lady of the Mercians, because you can create content online, but if you don't have in some ways a system around you, an ecosystem, it's just you posting. It's kind of, I've been inspired by them. They, things I've started, they've taken from. So, I feel it would have been wrong for me to be the sole author of any paper or presentation on this topic. And I don't think it would reflect social media, which is, I think, inherently collaborative, ultimately.
It should be.
Yeah.
But in that sense, what I'll give you more time to think about that history storytellers question. But in that sense, just a little bit more on Sad Girl. Because it's interesting that, and I know you've talked about this with Howard Williams in an interview you did with him as well. So obviously check that out, guys, as well at home. But it strikes me as a very not received wisdom way of interacting with the past. Going all the way down to things like, you don't name a skeleton in the ground. You don't think about how people felt about the burial. You analyze this after you've got the data. You definitely don't get emotional while you're digging up the skeleton, this kind of thing. God forbid. And it's interesting how that culture of received wisdom is possibly what we've been talking about all the way through here. How archaeologists should or shouldn't behave. But I mean, have you had much? Or maybe I don't want you to preempt your publication if you don't want to. But have you had much to reflect on in that sense about this as a practice, as actually quite a raw practice that's often discouraged? Even speaking in the first person used to be discouraged in academic publishing, didn't it?
Yeah. I think from speaking to Hannah and Charlotte, the big thing that we sort of wanted to really, if I'm going to be standing up and talking, and in my mind it's in front of every European archaeologist ever, was what's in my head. If I'm going to go and do this presentation, is to make people aware that we do know what we're doing. We're not silly girls on social media crying. Like, it's very intentional, and I, even to an extent, break my own ethics intentionally. To specifically, if we were to talk about the display of human remains, and it rarely gets someone pulling me up on my intentional hypocrisy, because that's, in some ways, I want to start those conversations. I'm like, yes, criticize me. Like, if I'm criticizing a museum for displaying human remains, criticize me for putting the bones up for so many million people to see in a video. Like, absolutely, that's hypocrisy.
Or describing the bones as beautiful or something like that.
Yeah, as beautiful, or crying in some ways. Definitely. Oh, I mean, there's one where I'm proper hysterically crying, which I thought was quite funny, and I was very intentional with my text, what I put in there. I think I called them pretty or something, like, and because I wanted to broach that almost creepy, over emotional, but then to force people to think about it, to force people to kind of do that shock, in a way, in some ways almost being a shock jock, that kind of thing, because in some ways, again, as I've said, I started posting because of pseudoscience, and the pseudo-archaeologists, the pseudoscientists, they are shock jocks. They create, like, oh my gosh, do you know what archaeologists are doing? Archaeologists are hiding. And I'm like, no. In some ways, I wanted to go to the most extreme of humanizing not just the bones, but archaeologists and their profession, like what we're doing. Because I've had so many comments from people being like, wait, I didn't realize archaeologists felt stuff about bones. I didn't think it meant. And like, having spoken to I made a video about my friend who spoke about how she'd excavated someone who was buried with a metal collar, the assumption being they were a slave, and how that to this day deep, and I'm sat there in like a coffee shop in Durham going, oh my gosh, you've just ripped my heart out right at this moment. Like, I have to make, because I feel like so often the pseudoscience feeds on, well, the archaeologists, don't they're hiding dinosaur bones under their beds. They're all quitting archaeology because big archaeology is telling them not to tell the truth about giants or, whatever. And so I'm like, if I create the over emotion, if I go to that extreme, if I, ultimately social media, as I said, it's entertainment. I provide an entertaining thing. I'm not naive to that, what I'm doing. It's a very intentional choice I've made here. And I feel like when we come to this paper, that's what I want to say, because I don't want senior academics to be looking at the content being like, oh my gosh, isn't she just stupid for crying? Why is she crying all the time? And I'm like, I don't know, have you ever seen an actor cry? But like, I know what I'm doing. We all know what we're doing. And, you don't have to necessarily agree with what we're doing. I mean, I don't necessarily know if all the time I agree what I do, but it's a choice I've made to fight against pseudoscience and to humanize not just the archaeological work, but archaeologists themselves, and to be like, hey, we are real people who enjoy our work, who feel something. I don't know. I feel you'd have to be pretty cold-hearted and not feel something ever,
Well, yeah. Absolutely, and I suppose giving ourselves permission to do that, to feel that publicly. I don't mean that as a reserved Brit. I mean that as this idea of scientific process and how you interact with data being the best way of doing it. Yeah, interesting. I think actually you've sort of answered the question about storytelling there, because in that sense, bringing in acting and bringing in that way of communication is that sort of unconventional approach that historians are, I think, better at. Look at Lucy Worsley and the way that she probably has the best cosplay wardrobe in all of humanity at this point. So yeah, I'm very conscious I don't want to run over our time together. So I suppose one more final comment for you, Andy, if you want, and then we can sign off with Steph if there's anything finally you want to just leave people with. Andy, any thoughts?
Very, very quick comment on storytelling. As people know, I do have a dodgy showbiz background before I went into archaeology professionally. I don't think it's any coincidence that the most successful TV program ever about archaeology, Time Team, was framed as a storytelling police procedural with an actor fronting it and acting as the intermediary between the audience and the professional archaeologists. It was done very deliberately, and it was done incredibly successfully, and people have been trying to make them, sprinkle the magic dust on other archaeology programs since, and it's never really worked as well. So basically, I think it's storytelling, engagement. It's something as archaeologists we just embrace, enjoy. It's one of the places we come together with the people we really should be talking to, which is the public, not just ourselves.
I suppose before I hand over to you, Steph, for the final word, I guess in that sense I would just add, practice what you preach. In that sense, if you believe archaeology is the story of humanity, let it be human, and let humans have an opinion as well. Steph?
I guess my final comment is to archaeologists and maybe those who look at social media and maybe are thinking, hey, I maybe want to, promote my work in different ways. Don't be afraid of social media. I think there's often a lot of fear that maybe you need to present a certain way, you need to do this. There's so much value in being authentic to yourself and being real when you're out there. And people want to know. People want to see you doing excavations. They want to learn how things work. They're curious. And don't let that hinder you. And also talk to people, reach out to people on social media. There are so many amazing creators doing great content, and DMs are always open. You can reach out and I've had people reach out and be like, hey, what style of content would you recommend for this? I'm working on an excavation. We want to advertise more. What do you recommend? And so I've given that advice. I think as archaeologists, it only helps us the more we talk to each other, the more we engage, the more we have these conversations. It can only bring value and help us.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for your time today, Steph. It's been a pleasure as always. Thank you, of course, Andy. And thank you guys at home for watching. Please do comment below. Keep the comments as ever respectful. Is there anything you think that we've missed or that you'd like to add in future episodes? Please do reach out to us either in the comments or in the email that you'll see in the video description below. Relevant links for Steph will be found below as well. Well worth a follow. And don't worry, she is okay. But until next time, guys, do take care.
And so are we.
Well, moderately. I mean, we're not normal, but we're okay.
That's a good way of doing it.
Until next time, guys, do take care. Bye-bye.